Hi everyone. We have now another installment in Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot series, and here she's sticking with her habit of basing her story titles on nursery rhymes, although Mrs. McGinty's Dead is not a nursery rhyme I've ever heard, and probably not one I'd recommend telling your young kids either. This novel is the next one after Taken at the Flood, which if you saw my video of that, you'll know it was among the worst Poirot mysteries I've read to date, and I don't think I'm alone in that sentiment. Luckily I enjoyed Mrs. McGinty's Dead more than that one, although not as much as I'd initially hoped, but we'll get to that. As always with my Agatha Christie reviews, I'm going to keep it spoiler-free for the first half, and then after I've covered all the territory I can there, I'll let you know so we can get into the really juicy parts for those of you who want to stick around. Not that there's all that much worth spoiling in this novel mystery-wise, though, because the mystery in this novel is a mess. Sorry, again, I'm getting ahead of myself. But let's just start out with what I really did appreciate about Mrs. McGinty's Dead. First of all, Poirot. In contrast with some of the other recent installments, like The Hollow and Taken at the Flood, where the central characters are those involved in the murder case, and Poirot just turns up later to do some sleuthing, in Mrs. McGinty's Dead, Poirot is front and center from the very start. Honestly, I don't mind the ones where Poirot plays more of a side role, but if you've ever been disappointed in a Poirot novel to find that Poirot's role is so much to the side that his character doesn't even come through, that is not the case here. Maybe even more than in some of his earliest cases narrated by Captain Hastings. In this case, we really get to follow Poirot's train of thoughts and exploration and peer into his order and method. Of course, the only place where this really falls short is that, as always, Poirot toys with the police and readers, only giving us little bits and pieces of what he's thinking until the big reveal at the very end. So in this case, it feels a little bit more awkward since we're so close in on the action, and yet it feels like Poirot's hardly able to offer us anything but some clues that, in this case, are just as likely to mislead the reader as to help us. In addition to Poirot, we also have the return of the crime writer Ariadne Oliver, who arrives in town and basically serves as Poirot's double on this case. Miss Oliver first appeared in Cards on the Table, but here, as she's no longer a potential suspect, but rather an unquestionable accomplice to Poirot, she really shines a lot more. Even funnier is how Miss Oliver often serves as a sort of stand-in character for Agatha Christie herself, even going as far as to make jabs about her own detective character Sven in a way that maybe allowed Christie to vent her own frustration with her best-selling character Poirot, with whom she'd apparently grown less fond of over the years, but he was so popular that she basically had to keep writing him. But seeing Miss Oliver and Poirot tag team together to solve this crime is great fun, and it simply wouldn't have been the same if it was a Poirot solo mission, even though he still remains the star of this show. What isn't great fun, though, is the mystery plot. I'm still not going to get into spoilers yet, by the way, but actually this was really disappointing because the murder initially had some unique elements, and Christie also introduced an interesting premise early on in the case. So it's a village murder mystery, like other recent ones, but it feels more along the lines of what's normally in a Miss Marple mystery than a Poirot mystery, as far as I know, though I've only read one Miss Marple, but this is what I've heard. And a country house mystery is nothing all that special, and we've seen it before. We also have an interesting question raised early on as to whether the murder was committed specifically with the intention of eliminating the victim, who didn't really seem to have any known enemies, or instead to frame the man to whom all the evidence pointed. This question, though, is pretty soon set aside and just ignored, leaving us to assume that it was resolved, but also wondering why it was even raised in the first place, given that it plays almost no role in the end. And you see, that's the big problem with this mystery. There are so many lines of reasoning, so many possibilities opened up, that rather than lead you sometimes slightly down the wrong track, but also get your mind thinking about the right stuff, instead these leads will just run you around in circles till you're dizzy and can't even remember who's who anymore, because there's just so much information to keep track of, and most of it utterly useless. Like, another thing about this case that was initially really interesting to me was when Poirot early on finds a clue that is a newspaper cutting with 4 old photographs of women with unsavory pasts involving murder or at least very suspicious circumstances. And here Christie basically makes us readers a promise that someone in the village must have been recognized as being one or more of these people, or at least somehow very closely related to them. And I'm going to give Christie credit there. This is a creative premise, different from things she's done before, which is getting harder to do, given that she's written so many mysteries now. And although I've complained in the past about how unsatisfying it can sometimes feel when, at the end of the book, someone is revealed to be a totally different person than who we thought they were, the case of mistaken identity without sufficient warning, here it works much better because Christie is telling us up front, look, there is a mistaken identity, maybe even more than one mistaken identity. You just need to connect the dots. A really exciting premise, but then one that totally fails in execution. We're constantly being fed information about what's important. Can we rule out any of these four people? Can we trust the personal stories that were told in the newspaper clipping? And on and on. But unfortunately, rather than make it clear to us readers what can be trusted and what's fair game to be unreliable, I was repeatedly left throughout this book with an impression that simply nothing we're being told is reliable. Which isn't all that fun because unlike in a more successful Poirot mystery where we're made to feel clever for figuring out certain little things, all while we're being tricked about the more important things, in this novel I wasn't even proud of the things that I did figure out because it simply felt like blind guesswork rather than real deduction. And thus, when I looked through some reviews on Goodreads after finishing the book, I was unsurprised to find a lot of people agreeing that the mystery was not nearly as strong or enjoyable as the other aspects of the story, like the characterization and the setup, and even just observing Poirot up close for once. I will take this opportunity, though, to bring up one redeeming quality, which is that even if you aren't crazy about the solution at the end, this probably isn't going to be one of those stories where you're utterly disappointed in the solution. I mean, Christie has a lot of good mystery solutions, but also some that are pretty far out there, and there must have been at least one or two Poirot mysteries where I thought my solution was as believable or even more believable than the one Poirot offered. This is not one of those, but it's kind of because by halfway through the book, I could already tell I wasn't even going to bother making a serious guess at the murderer. Any leads I had come across at one point had already been discussed and shot down by Poirot, and very early on at that. Finally, although some people liked observing the characters, I can't say these ones were anywhere among my favorites of Christie's. A few of them really came to life, except when they were doing things that just made you want to whack them over the head. You see, these aren't characters who you really like that much, and I say that as someone who even often finds rotten, nasty, conceited, or otherwise awful characters to be interesting and well written. These ones, though, are more of just a pain than anyone deliciously hateable. Okay, though, enough of that. Before I start the spoilers, I'll just wrap this up by saying I did enjoy this book for its potential, and it had its strong moments, but it really fizzled out by the end. I found myself towards the start of the book thinking this would be a really good premise for a short story, but we're going to get a full-length novel of it. But to my chagrin, it should have stayed a short story. It's worth a read if you're a big Poirot fan, but it's not one of the first 20 Poirot novels I recommend. I'm going to start the spoilers now, so if you don't want to see that section, I'll give you a minute to pause and escape. Alright, I really don't have too much more to say about this one because I already covered most of the stuff I was thinking about in a vague way within the spoiler-free section. And unfortunately, I was able to say most of the stuff I liked about the book without giving spoilers, so this part is just going to be me complaining about the mystery setup and solution. I mentioned that I didn't even have a guess at who the murderer was because, well, okay, I will say it seemed like there was a lot of evidence presented that implicated Mrs. Weatherby, so I felt like I was supposed to suspect her, and I kind of did, except also I really didn't think it could be her based on some of the gut feeling, or maybe just the fact that Christie pointed too hard at her towards the beginning of the story. I mean, we learned that she had a lot of photos in her house that Mrs. McGinty had rummaged through while cleaning, and then Mrs. Upward makes a reference to those photos later, which may have just been a lie from what we learn about Miss Upward later. There are hints about Mrs. Weatherby's past, and then the murder weapon was obtained from her house, though in another convoluted exchange with differing testimonies about when it took place. Oh yeah, and this is an aside, but we later learn that this murder weapon was just sitting out at a place where anyone could have taken it and passed unnoticed, so the whole question of the weapon and who possessed it was just a wild goose chase entirely, and it was a random person who came and took it. Not to mention the resemblance to the means of murder used by Lily Gamble, one of the other women in the four original photographs. Yep, also another total coincidence, total red herring. And that mystery of the four photographs in the newspaper, boy, what a disappointment that was for me. You see, I think Christie just got too complicated with this. For example, I actually did guess at one point, I bet Evelyn Kane's child was a boy and not a girl, since Poirot was so clear in establishing the point that something was inaccurate about the bios of these four women. But that's the thing where rather than making me feel clever and like I was onto something, this realization that the child didn't even have to be a girl at all just made me think at a point where I was already having trouble keeping track of the possibilities. Gee, it really could have been absolutely anyone then. We have nothing to go off of. I will say, though, that although I'm finding it hard to imagine someone piecing together this mystery by anything more than guesswork, if you did manage to figure it out, I think this piece could have been a really important clue, that the child could have been a boy. Even so, though, I may have missed other evidence of this, but I wouldn't say that there was positive evidence that led me to think the child was a boy. I basically just concluded this was likely because that would be misleading, which of course probably isn't the way detectives of order and method should be doing their sleuthing. Okay, so as I think I've harped on more than enough by this point, this mystery is just really complicated. But I have more. The suspects in the novel. Who are the suspects? I mean, we know some people who are definitely suspects, but throughout this book, I was a little unsettled by two characters who were too far from the center of attention to have really been satisfying for me if they'd turned out to be the murderer, but also appeared too frequently to be ruled out completely. One of those being a woman who hears all the village gossip and would have had ample opportunity to read anyone's mail, the village postwoman, Mrs. Sweeteman. And the other being Maud Williams, who, of course, there was no good reason to think that she would be the murderer of Mrs. McGinty. Yet she was being pretty shifty the whole time, and then in the last few pages we're told that she in fact did show up with a pistol at the victim's house on the night of the second murder, intending to possibly shoot someone. I guess summing it all up, maybe this plot is a good case study for mystery writers because it's a demonstration of why some amount of constraint in the mystery is needed. A mystery is more satisfying when there are just a few different main possibilities, each with its own ambiguities, and each with maybe a few false assumptions that are eventually disproved or challenged with a surprise ending that fits within the realm of possibility but just beyond what the reader was thinking. Here, though, there were so many possibilities that I simply failed to keep up. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just getting old. Let me know what you did like about this book, especially if there were aspects of the mystery plot that you really liked, because I know there are plenty of people out there that enjoyed it. And if you're watching this video at all, there's a decent chance that you're one of them. Until next time, happy reading.